This is Grace Notes. I'm Alan Button, and it's our privilege for this special Veterans Day edition of Grace Notes to have with us in the studio Dan Jones. Dan is a World War II Air Force veteran, drafted in 1943, longtime North Carolina resident, active in Boy Scouts for decades. In fact, the recipient of the Silver Beaver Award and Lifetime Achievement Award, active in his church for many, many years, still active, in fact, in disaster relief. There's a lot we could talk about with Dan, who's going to turn 96 here in a very short time, but let me stop there for now. Dan, welcome.
Thank you.
Dan, if we could, let's start at the beginning, where you were born and how you made your way to the Pacific.
Okay, I was born in McCall, South Carolina, November 21st, 1922, and grew up there. Wonderful place to grow up as a child, primarily a textile community. I graduated from high school in McCall, and then I attended Wingate Junior College, graduated there in 1941. On the day I entered Wingate, Germany entered Poland, beginning World War II.
And that was September 1st, 1939?
September the 1st, 1939. And after graduating from Wingate, for a short while, I worked in a textile mill, knowing that I probably was going into service soon. In early 1943, I was drafted and was assigned for training as an aircraft mechanic. And after graduating from the mechanic school, I was asked if I would like to go to a specialist school, and I chose to go to electrical specialist school. After graduating from the electrical specialist school, I was chosen to go into flight engineer training for the B-29 program. The B-29 was a brand new thing at that time, had not actually been announced as a military plane. But I went through several courses of training out at the Boeing factory in Seattle, and then went to Clovis, New Mexico for flight training. After being on flying status for 13 days, they pulled 137 of us off and put us in ground crew because we were trained to handle that work. And after being assigned to a permanent unit, I was assigned to the 498th Bombardment Group, 874th Bombardment Squadron. In a very short while, was on the way overseas. We wound up going to Saipan in the Pacific, and we operated from there. Were the first ones to bomb Tokyo from land-based aircraft. And over a period of the next months until the end of the war, we destroyed the infrastructure at Japan. And after the war, I returned and was discharged on the 22nd of December in 1945.
Tell you what, Dan, let me interrupt there, and we'll come back and pick up at that point shortly. Let me ask you, going back to the time you were drafted, what were the circumstances then in your area, in the region you grew up in, and how did you feel about being drafted?
I had actually planned to volunteer earlier, but my father had asked me not to because my mother was going through some very serious problems, and he did not want to be left alone. Actually, at one point, she had almost died from a hemorrhage and was in lengthy hospitalization.
Now, was that before or after your time at Wingate College?
That was after.
So you were drafted...
Shortly after my 20th birthday, I was drafted, 1943, February of 43.
Well, you've identified a song for us that has some reference to your time at Wingate College. The Way You Look Tonight by Fred Astaire. Tell us about it.
Well, you know, at that age, most of us were involved with some girls. And a buddy of mine and I were all coming back from some adventure we had been on. I don't know what now. But anyway, the girls were hanging out the window of the girls' dormitory. We didn't have air conditioning at that time. The girls had to stay in the dorms. Wingate was a Baptist institution, and the girls were somewhat restricted. But we boys had more freedom than that. But anyway, my friend could sing, and I recall vividly we're standing there in the moonlight singing The Way You Look Tonight. One of those things.
It sounds like a movie scene.
It does sound that way.
And in fact, the song comes from the film Swing Time, starring Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. So were you successful, you and your buddy?
Oh, well, hardly. Oh, we had some good times.
The girls stayed in the windows.
The girls stayed in the windows. They were unable to do otherwise. But, of course, we dated on weekends and whatnot. And as frequently as we could find some other activity, a club or something that we belonged to.
Very good. Well, let's hear the song that won the Academy Award for Best Original Song in 1936. From the film Swing Time, starring Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, The Way You Look Tonight by
It'd be good to hear it again.
by Fred Astaire.
Someday, when I'm awfully low, when the world is cold,
That was The Way You Look Tonight by Fred Astaire. If you're just joining us, our guest is Dan Jones, World War II Air Force veteran, active in his community for many, many years. And again, our privilege to have him in the studio with us on this special Veterans Day edition of Grace Notes. Dan, if you could, let me have you do a little geography lesson for us. You mentioned you were on Saipan. Tell us where that is in relation to Japan and the Pacific generally.
Saipan is one of the Marianas group, which is about 110 miles north of Guam. You may be more familiar with Guam than Saipan. Guam was an American or United States possession prior to the war. Of course, had been captured by the Japanese. And Saipan was a major military base for the Japanese, primarily because Saipan had a harbor and Guam did not. And we needed a base for large bombing aircraft. And, of course, that's the reason they invaded Saipan.
The Marines did.
Our Marines invaded Saipan. There were, I think if I remember the statistics, the Japanese had about 22,000 soldiers on Saipan. That's, let's say, about halfway to the Philippines and, of course, about 1,500 miles south of Japan. And our mission there was a long mission, involved at least 14 hours for the bombing crews. The B-29 was the first pressurized military aircraft. And, of course, the crew could cruise in comfort until they got near the target. They had to depressurize when they went over the targets.
So it was 14 hours from Saipan to Japan?
Well, and back.
I see. It was a two-way trip.
Airspeed was about 300 miles per hour.
At the point that you made it to Saipan, had there been an American airfield in place at that point?
No, there was not an airfield on Saipan. Our forces had to completely build that facility. Our Air Force engineers, which of course was a branch, at that time we were the Army Air Corps anyway. We were not the Air Force. Air Force didn't exist until 1945. But our Air Force engineers went in immediately behind the Marines to start building the airfield. They managed to open a quarry on the mountain, which was primarily coral rock, and that coral rock was what was used for most of the highways and for the runways. And at times the engineers had to get down off their bulldozers and whatever and pick up their guns and do a little fighting. But then we came in, the group behind them, to set up the actual operation. And, of course, we were basically in a sugarcane field and living in pup tents and eating K-rations for a while there while we tried to get things underway.
What were your duties in particular?
My military occupational specialty was aircraft electrical specialist. And I was assigned to the instrument division because they had more electricians than they did instrument people. And so I was in a group where three of us, each of us had 5 B-29s to maintain all the instruments on. We had one man who was ahead of the staff sergeant who was ahead of the group. But that's where I fitted into it. And, of course, to start with, we had to build our living facilities, set up pyramidal tents where we could have cots, not be sleeping on the ground in the mud. And that took a little while, and of course they had to build some roads so that we could get around and build the airfield and all of the hard stands that the aircraft had to park on and that kind of thing.
And was it while you were in Saipan that Iwo Jima was invaded and taken
Well,
over?
then somewhat later. We were in operation a good long time before Iwo Jima was invaded, but it was a hindrance to us because the Japanese stationed fighter aircraft at Iwo Jima, and they would attempt to attack our B-29s as they made their way to Japan.
Iwo Jima was north of Saipan.
It was north of Saipan. I believe it was almost halfway between Saipan and Japan. And it was important that we take Iwo Jima in order to protect the B-29s. And that was why they spent the terrible cost that they did to capture Iwo Jima.
We'll come back to that shortly because you've got another song that had some special significance for you as a military man and most, if not all, of your fellow soldiers. Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree by the Andrews Sisters.
It had a significance for us.
Tell us about it.
Well, most of us had a girl back home, and I had a girl I had dated for quite a while, and I thought we had a pretty sound relationship.
You had an understanding,
we had an understanding, and unfortunately, she continued to correspond with me. We didn't have cell phones back then, and she continued to correspond with me, and then all of a sudden, the letters quit coming, and I, of course, kept questioning why. And finally, she was a school teacher, and finally her roommate wrote me and told me that she was married and had moved to Florida. So I got jilted. But the song prior to that, of course, had been very applicable when you say, don't sit under the apple tree with anybody else but me. But in her case, she found another apple tree.
She was sitting under another apple tree.
It hurt for a while, but I got over it.
Let's hear the song, Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree, by the Andrews Sisters. It was a song, actually, that debuted in 1939 on Broadway and became very popular during the war. In fact, first place in the hit parade from October 42 to January 43. Here it is, Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree.
I wrote my mother, just you and me, when I come marching home.
That was Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree by the Andrews Sisters. Our guest today is Dan Jones. Dan, you were telling us about the development of the air base on Saipan and the bombing of Japan. Why don't you pick up there, if you would?
We, of course, got the base operative along about the latter part of September in 1944. They first got the runway completed for 6,000 feet, which limited the capacity for loading the planes. B-29 would handle 20,000 pounds of bombs, but they subsequently extended that to 9,000 feet, then immediately began constructing a parallel runway for 9,000 feet, which gave us our total capacity to get 180 B-29s off in a short period of time. We got to the point where we could get one plane every 30 seconds off. And to get big planes like that off in that period of time was almost miraculous. The handlers were very, very good at doing that.
You saw that happen, 180 planes, one every 30 seconds.
Taking off, one every 30 seconds. It obviously took a while to get them all off, but to see them lined up ready for takeoff was a sight to behold.
A dramatic sight for sure.
Very, very much so.
Where were you and what were you doing when the bombing of Japan ended?
I think you're getting to my few days on Tinian Island.
Well, that was part of it, I know.
Tinian was only 3 miles from Saipan. After they captured Saipan, they sent the 2nd Marine Division in and captured Tinian. It was basically easier to capture that after they had taken Saipan because it wasn't armored near as heavily. But where I was concerned, I happened to be on Tinian Island on a 3-day detached duty on the day that they dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, or Hiroshima, as I think they try to call it now. And I did see the Enola Gay. I was not involved in any way in that squadron, but it was just a coincidence that I was there.
Enola Gay being the bomber
that's
dropped
the plane that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima.
How did you make your way home after that?
From Saipan
Yeah.
to the States after the war?
Uh-huh.
I lacked a half point of being able to come home with the group.
There was a point system.
The point system.
You had
in the entire military establishment.
You had how many points?
I had 59 and a half.
You needed 60.
I needed 60. And when the squadron got ready to come home, I was transferred to Guam. Not alone, of course. There were a group of us. And we were only at Guam a couple of weeks. And our only duty there was to help tear down their facility, getting ready to close out. And we were called in one afternoon and told that they had some LSTs, landing craft, that just bobbled around on top of the water, more or less. And
personnel transport type?
Yeah, they carried the tank, landing craft tank. And they told us that they had some coming to the States, and if we wanted to come, we could take a cot and a blanket and ride the open deck. And so we all agreed that that's what we wanted to do to get home.
Sleeping on a cot on the open deck was better than staying in Guam.
It's better than staying in Guam. And so we rode the LST to Hawaii, and they took us off there. They said that the weather was too bad at Los Angeles, and we would have to wait for better transportation. And we were there a few days, and then they put us on a converted liner coming to Los Angeles, port of Wilmington, which was at Los Angeles. And then, of course, we were there. They fed us royally the first night. They had Italian POWs serving.
Uh-huh. Some good Italian food. Huh?
They gave us all the steak and ice cream, everything that we could use. And in that end of that few days, they put us on a train, a coach car, no sleeper, all the way to Fort Gordon, Georgia. And I was in Fort Gordon only a couple of days processing discharge, and was discharged on the 22nd of December in 1945, 3 days before Christmas. Anxious to get home.
For sure. Well, Dan, I know there's a lot that has happened in your life since then. You've been in North Carolina for 56 years, I think you told me.
Right.
And I think maybe we're going to have you back another time to maybe talk about those years. But before we wrap up, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on changes you've seen over your lifetime and what Veterans Day means to you.
Things have changed drastically in the 96 years that I've lived. Obviously, I grew up during the Great Depression. Everybody was poor. I didn't think I would be able to go to college at all. I was able to get a work scholarship and attended Wingate. And after the first year, I was fortunate to be chosen by the biology professor as his laboratory assistant. And my second year in college, I actually conducted the lab's freshman biology. And in doing so, I was on a NYA, National Youth Administration scholarship, drew $29 a month. Of course, all I ever saw was the check to sign it, but it paid a good part of my cost. The biggest changes have come about through communication and the development of aviation and the things that resulted from the changes in aviation. From the puddle jumpers, who, when they flew over when I was a boy, everybody came running out of the house to see what they looked like, until the B-29s, which was a super development, the first really controlled by electronics. The electronics in the B-29 probably would fill a 3-door file cabinet that you could today put in a cell phone. But nevertheless, there's a tremendous development that carried over into the civilian operations. And then the development of the telephone, or communication in general, television, the fact that, as I say, we didn't have a telephone until after I got home, after the war, and then we had a party line phone. And today, everybody, including the children in grammar school, have a cell phone in their pocket.
Well, yourself included. I think I heard your phone go off here just a couple of minutes ago.
That happens.
What about Veterans Day? Does that have special meaning to you?
Veterans Day is an important time. My father was a World War I veteran. When I was growing up, it was only 4 years after the end of World War I, and every Armistice Day at 11 o'clock, the fire siren was sounded lengthily, as it had done on the actual Armistice Day. So it always meant much to us even at that time. Obviously, that date carries over with me, though November the 11th wasn't the day. September the 2nd was the important day with me, which was, I believe that was VJ Day. But nevertheless,
victory over Japan.
Victory over Japan, right. But it's important that we celebrate November the 11th as Veterans Day, in which the nation takes time to at least think about we guys who gave part of our life in service to the country.
Good place to wrap things up, I think, Dan. It's been a treat to have you here, and you've identified another song for us that has some significance to, I gather, the hope and perhaps optimism that you have, The White Cliffs of Dover. Tell us about it.
The White Cliffs of Dover, though it speaks especially to the British people who during the Battle of Britain had to send their children out in the country as where they had other relatives, but it spoke of the hopes that all of us had all the time we were in service, that we were trying to defend our nation. And it spoke to us in a way that a song can speak to you. And I thought it was in keeping with this celebration.
Dan, thank you for being with us, and thank you for your service, and happy Veterans Day.
Thank you.
Let's hear it, The White Cliffs of Dover by Vera Lynn.
There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover, and a sea.
You've been listening to Grace Notes, a special program here on Life 103.1 featuring people who may be relatively unknown, but who meet life's challenges in ways that brighten the lives of those around them. Our producer is Christina Dolan. I'm Alan Button, and we invite you to join all of us here at the station again next Friday at 5:30 for Grace Notes on Life 103.1.